This is really, really interesting times, as Dan said. And, I think that we're at this moment where we can really think about reinvention. And I love this. I won't tell you a joke. That would be a terrible thing for a presenter to do, especially virtually. But I will tell you about a joke. There's this city slicker, and he's driving through the countryside, and he's trying to find his destination, and he's having a terrible time, and he's hopelessly lost. And finally, he sees a farmer as he's driving by a field, and he kind of waves the farmer down and slows his car down and says, hey, how do I find my destination? And the farmer says, if you want to go there, I wouldn't start from here. And I just love this. I think it's such an analogy for where we are. Who would have predicted going through a global pandemic? Who would have predicted that we would be in this kind of dystopian reality together? But interestingly, the root of the word emergency is actually emerger, meaning to rise up or out. And we can actually find some really new and interesting ways to reinvent, to refresh. Absolutely believe that this is a moment to accelerate. This will be the most significant reinvention of work in our experience. And that may be different region to region, industry to industry, company to company. But at a meta level, this will be utter reinvention. And the reason is all the disruption. When you get disrupted so much, it causes you to think so much more consciously about your work preferences, your workplace, your work colleagues. And so we've got this moment to really accelerate. And maybe that means a 180-degree shift. Maybe it's just a right angle turn, but we really, really have this moment together. And culture will be so critical. And it's been so interesting for us because at the beginning of the pandemic, there were so many business leaders who were kind of running around, figuratively speaking, doing things, really, really seeking to make changes right away in order to respond to the pandemic. And then lots of business leaders just pressed the pause button and said, we aren't sure. We don't know what the evidence is. We don't know the best approaches. And therefore, we're just going to pause. And now we're starting to see this unfreezing. We're starting to see business leaders say, what should we do? How do we move forward? And it reminds me of early, this is hashtag work from home. Truffle, stop. I'm so sorry. This is hashtag work from home. I've got this dog who never makes a sound, and now she is all about the person at the door.
Bring her on camera, really, if she wants to speak.
Yeah, exactly. Let me just grab her.
Isn't it interesting how much you learn about people in virtual mode? Yes, we're disconnected, but in some ways you get to see people's homes, their children, their dogs, their pets, and back to Tracy.
It's true. I actually just wrote a blog post that I posted on LinkedIn, and it talked about the intimacy of distance, the paradox of we're all so far away, and yet we've invited each other into our homes, and we have crazy things happening in the background. So thanks you all for being patient with my work from home situation. So we're in this moment together, and we're at this point of unfreezing where business leaders are saying, where do we go now? I think about, 25 years ago, we would talk to business leaders about culture and the impact of place. And they would say, but culture, does it really matter? Can you prove that there's a business benefit? And I think now we're in this point where business leaders are saying, I always knew culture was important. We're seeing deterioration of our culture, and we really, really need to move forward in some new ways. And we like to say that culture and place are so related because place is the most visible artifact of culture. And you think about, the Edgar Schein model of culture, where it's like an iceberg, and under the surface of the water are norms and assumptions and values. You all know this. And above the surface of the water is place. And when lots of businesses sent everybody home, it limited our ability to send cues through place. It limited that visibility of some of those artifacts kind of like we have five senses and we're, putting a blindfold on and we're relying on the other four senses. And culture happens everywhere, not just in place. Clearly, we all know that, but place can be really powerful. So we will talk some more about that. We have been doing tons of really awesome research. I'm a bit of a research geek, so apologies for my enthusiasm, but we've done both qualitative and quantitative studies with no less than 32,000 people. And we've done 8 separate studies with more happening in terms of that plus sign. And so this is what I'll share with you a little bit today, is some of our research and some of how we're thinking about the relationship between culture and place more specifically. So we have a couple poll questions for you. We'd love to get your perspective. So I think Nellie's going to launch this poll for us. How significant do you expect the changes in the work experience to be? I gave you my impressions on that, but you will have your own. A, sweeping, things will never be the same. B, moderate, things will be different, but may not be too significant. Insignificant, things will be crazy for a while, but then they will pretty much get back to normal. Or D, I'll let you know in a month or two. So go ahead and answer when you're ready. That would be terrific. I think that we're in this really interesting moment where we've had such an ebb and flow of the virus. And we have gotten to a point where we may be really exhausted, our cultures may be suffering, morale may be suffering. I think part of the challenge is the uncertainty, is the ebb and the flow. I live in Michigan, Denison is in Michigan, we're surrounded by water around here. And you know how if you spend the day on a boat, even if you're not in a water state or country, if you've ever been on a boat for the day, sometimes you come back at the end of the day and you're just exhausted. And you say to yourself, why am I exhausted? I was with friends, I was in the sun, I was eating snacks, it was wonderful. The reason we're exhausted after spending the day on a boat is that at a physical level, you're constantly reacclimating, getting equilibrium, kind of finding your equilibrium again and again at a physical level, even if you're sitting down on the boat. And I think that's what we've been going through with the pandemic, this ebb and flow, this following the development of the virus across states and countries, across friends and family and coworkers, has been exhausting because it's been this constant kind of reacclimating. And so it's super interesting to see how this affects us in terms of how we look forward and how we anticipate. So Natalie, how are we seeing the results on this one?
It looks like we have 45% selected choice B, but it was a pretty close one. 41% chose option A as well. So between A and B.
Okay, sounds good. The thing that's super interesting here as well is that I've been asking this question for a long time. And at the very beginning of the pandemic, many, many more people said they thought the changes were going to be sweeping. And now, as the pandemic has kind of gone on, more people are saying that the changes will be moderate. And I think what's happening is our adaptability. We humans are nothing if not adaptable. And as we adapt, we have a new starting point, a new point from which we're looking at that future. And as we adapt, we're kind of stretching, growing, really developing our resilience. So it's interesting to hear what your perspectives are. In our research, we found that lots of people expect to work from home 1 day a week or less. They expect to be in the office part of the time and at home part of the time. We know that there is going to be a talent revolution, no less than a talent revolution, because of the new demands of workers, because of the new ways that we're thinking about flexibility, because of the new ways that we will be thinking about attracting and retaining and engaging and developing based on all that we've learned so far. We also know that organizations are tending to meet people where they are. 72% of organizations say that they're expecting a hybrid work model. 23% expect to get back to the office, and 5% are saying, hey, we're going to let people work from home pretty predominantly. This is interesting to us because this has implications for culture. How we lead differently, how we make decisions differently, how we involve people differently, how we adapt differently, accountability, how we create consistency, how we create a sense of mission, those will be different if we're all together again in the same old way, or if we're connecting across multiple locations and still needing to find that connection with each other. And leaders are saying that they're expecting greater flexibility. Even from April to September, we heard leaders saying, yeah, we expect more policies and practices and approaches that allow for flexibility. So you all know the definition of culture, but one of the things I really like to think about is the idea of really what people do when no one's looking. If hybrid future is where we're going, then more and more culture is doing hard work. We think about culture and the way that it exists in place and the automatic nature of the way that we form relationships, of the way that we look for cues from our colleagues. I have a colleague who says, when you're not in the office, you can't hear the birds singing. Isn't that lovely? When you're in the office, you run into somebody, you can kind of get a sense for what's going on in the work cafe. You can kind of chat with somebody in the elevator lobby, or as Graham would say, in the area for the lifts, because those are moments when we're making those connections and checking in and sensing the culture. We heard in the conference yesterday that culture is about kind of how it feels to work here, and how it feels to work here is so related to hearing the birds chirping, hearing each other, checking in with each other in the physical space. Other thing to consider is, how do we think about creating the conditions for happiness? And how do we think about a culture that supports people and that really, really respects them? And we know that that's absolutely fundamental to the Denison DNA and to the DNA of those of us who care about this topic. But from a happiness standpoint, I really like to think about the idea of both agency and structure. Agency, we all have responsibility. We can make choices and create the conditions, and we all have such a bearing on other people. My role in the culture is a big deal. The people I run into, the way that I interact, because sociologically speaking, the number one way that we learn is by watching other people, even if we're not consciously aware of it. We kind of watch and learn. And there is structure. Companies, organizations, communities, societies have a responsibility to people to create the best conditions that we can for people to bring their best. And I think the other thing that's really important is that happiness can ebb and flow. You know, we don't have to be like butterflies and daisies every day. We can have a sense of kind of ebb and flow of happiness and still overall have a sense of contentment and joy. I think that's important to us from a culture standpoint, because every single day won't be easy in our organizations. And I think when we have that constructive, productive culture, it gives us that resilience. It gives us that ability to work through it. One of the things that I've been asking people about is, when I talk to customers especially, to what extent have you been surprised by your culture? Because that will unlock cues for you about that culture. And you may figure out that your match with the culture wasn't what you thought it was. We've talked to people who have said, you know, I always thought we were really nimble and agile, but we have been struggling to make decisions. Or in our case, I always thought we had a culture that was, you know, open and sharing, but the level of transparency at our organization lately has been just incredible. And it has caused me to kind of recommit to our culture. I'm a huge Steelcase fan anyway, but it really causes this kind of recommitment. And the surprise is what matters in our brains, because that's where we say, huh, that isn't what I thought. I've learned something new that's important, or, I can really reappreciate. So I think this idea of kind of the ebb and flow of happiness and conditions can be so mitigated by really, really strong cultures. Here's another question for you. To what extent do you believe your experience of culture contributes to happiness? And we can launch this poll, Nellie, if you don't mind. Totally, after all, it's context for a huge part of our lives. B, somewhat. I don't think we should overstate it. Or C, it's complicated. I love this because I think that it's all about, we spend something like 80% of our time at work with work colleagues in the work situation. And so how we create the conditions for people to have a positive experience there matter a lot. And as we think about place is so apparent as we think about showing up, feeling a level of buzz, feeling a level of commonality in terms of our social identity. So we will talk a little bit more about that. Nellie, can you give us a sense of the results on this one? Ah, perfect. 68% believe it's a huge part of things. 15% and 19% are feeling differently about that in terms of saying somewhat or it's complicated. So really, really appreciate that. Our perspectives matter so much in terms of our own experiences and how that informs us. So that's terrific. I heard this from a customer lately. And of course, we work with people who think about place all the time. How can you live your culture if you don't live in your culture? I love this. And of course, culture is broader than our physical boundaries, but there's something about being together that makes a difference. We know that from a SHRM study, Society for Human Resource Management, 2/3 of business leaders are struggling to maintain morale and 1/3 are struggling to maintain culture. From a separate study by Qualtrics, we found that 75% of people were struggling with mental health challenges, with social isolation, depression, anxiety, things like that. And that was perfectly correlated with how much they were working from home. More work from home, more feelings of social isolation. So place matters to our norms, assumptions, values. It matters to the way that we really feel about ourselves and feel about our situations. Here's some interesting data from our study, and this is in particular from a study of 4,400 people globally. We found that people love to work from home because they like wearing their fuzzy slippers and they really appreciate no commute, no surprise there, but they're also missing their people. The other interesting takeaway here is there's no one size fits all. Everybody has different conditions at home, and I may be incredibly productive if I've got a dedicated home office and lots of space and few distractions. Or I may be, working in a small apartment in a major metropolitan area with my partner, and I'm facilitating learning for our children, and I'm caring for somebody in my life who's kind of at an elder age. Those conditions are really different. And so our opportunity is to take what we've learned from this last 16 months and bring it into place, bring it into our awareness of how we create brilliant cultures. I think the other thing that's interesting here is that a lot of people say, we want to come back to the office to collaborate. Maybe we could do all of our focused work at home and we could do all of our collaboration in the office. But we absolutely know that people will want to do all kinds of work in the office. Absolutely, collaboration will be at the top of the list. And people will want to focus, they will want to learn and rejuvenate and form those social connections. And so our opportunity is to create the conditions for all of those kinds of work to occur. We've also, in our studies of work experience and workplace, found that people have new kinds of expectations for where we go and how we move forward from here. One of those is safety, and that's not just about kind of physical safety, that's also about psychological safety. Really feeling like our team members have our backs, feeling like we can kind of bring our best. It's okay to try new things. It's okay to kind of bring our eclectic sense of humor because we feel that sense of psychological safety. And this is table stakes, right? People want to know that we're cleaning the building, that they're not going to have too much density, that we've got the right visitor protocols. All of those things matter in new and important ways. The other thing that people are craving is belonging. We are missing our people, and this isn't news to any of us. But one of the things that I love about this concept is that neurologically speaking, belonging isn't just about being back with our people. That's part of it. It's also having a sense of common social identity, that shared sense of mutual dependency. And I think about the Denison model and that mission quadrant. That's a big deal in terms of people feeling like they're pulling in that same direction. People want to be supported in their performance and productivity, and they want comfort and control. We asked people, what did you like about working from home? And people said, oh, it was the variety of settings, which I guess means I can work at my kitchen island or my living room couch. That doesn't feel like huge variety to me, but I've curated it. I've chosen it. It's my space. And that's a big deal too. So as we think about the office and kind of coming back, our opportunity will be to really think about variety, think about cultures that allow us that sense of choice, that I really can work in the work cafe or work in an enclave or work away from my typical workstation. That sense of choice, that sense of permission makes a really big difference. So here's another poll question for you. To what extent do you believe employee expectations are changing? So Nellie, if we want to launch this one, that would be great. I've told you how we're learning about employee expectations changing, but your experience may be different. A, totally, the expectations are greater than ever. B, to some extent, I think we just don't know yet. C, not so much. I think people have gotten used to things and the changes aren't so significant. Or D, expectations, sure, but mostly we just want to get back to our people. So really curious what you have to say about this one. I think this is behind the talent revolution. I was facilitating a roundtable with senior executives, leaders of companies, and in particular HR executives who were along with the senior leaders of companies. And there was this amazing thing we were talking about. They literally can't get applications for open jobs. It's not that they're getting applicants who aren't qualified. They're not getting applicants. They're being poached. They're absolutely having a terrible time with both attraction and retention. And it was really interesting. This one HR leader said, every single thing we've ever tried to attract people is failing today. That was just gut punch stuff, right? Like, this is a talent revolution because we are having to reinvent the way we think about attracting people to our organizations, and culture will be a really important part of that. Place will be as well. Nellie, what are we seeing on this one in terms of our results? Ah, beautiful. Oh, this is like a normal distribution. If we tip it on its side, 41% of you are saying totally, 43% are saying to some extent. Beautiful. And then 8% and 8% on the others. Really, really interesting to hear your perspectives. Thank you for sharing those. I think it's really interesting too. You may have seen some of the articles about Zoom towns. This is fascinating, right? Sociologically, what we're expecting is that lots of people will move out of major markets because they can work from anywhere. So they don't have to live in San Francisco or Chicago or Manhattan anymore if they can work from a mid-market, which has maybe lower cost of living or theoretically higher quality of life, depending on what you're looking for. And so that matters if you're in a major market or a major organization, because you can attract from theoretically anywhere. It also matters if you're one of those mid-markets. All of a sudden, Ann Arbor, Michigan, Grand Rapids, Michigan, name your city, state, country, can be a place where people are pulling your talent. And so I think culture will be so critical for the way that we attract, retain, engage, develop, and place may or may not be a part of that employee value equation, depending on that hybrid model. I love this. Proximity is the most important determinant of relationships. So as we think about place, as we think about culture, I think another way to think about that is through the lens of proximity. There was a beautiful PhD study that was done years ago, and this PhD candidate was looking at the dynamics of follow-up, follow through, and task completion. And she had people collaborating with others across the building in the same company, across the nation, and across the globe. And what she found was that the follow-up, follow-through, and task completion was perfectly correlated with distance. When people were closer together, they tended to follow up more effectively. When they were further apart, they tended to not as much. And what was the twist on the study was that all of the people were sitting next to each other in individual conference rooms, and they just didn't know about it. Proximity is so much about perception. And so we can think about how to create those proximities, whether we're in the office together, whether we're, working next to each other on a manufacturing line, whether we're working together in a distribution center or on the front line, or whether we are remote and spread out. And so as we think about creating that sense of proximity, that will be part of how we think about talent. The other thing I really, really like to consider is this idea of how familiarity tends to breed acceptance. We know statistically and sociologically that the more we see someone, the more we tend to become familiar and accepting of them. It's because we have more data, we have more evidence. We might just kind of get them a little bit more. So their behaviors are more easily explained in our minds based on, hey, I've seen a lot of that person. I kind of understand where they're coming from. I kind of know what's going on with them. In fact, there was a great example of this. There's a song that became popular years ago in the US, and it's called Hey Ya by a group called The Outcast. And it's a super funky song. It's a really different kind of vibe. And the record label really, really wanted it to be successful. And so what they did is they would play it on the radio. This is back when we listened to radios. They would play it on the radio after Celine Dion songs. She was really big at the time. And everybody was really familiar with Celine Dion. And so they would play this Hey Ya song right after the Celine Dion songs. And the seepage is what would happen. The acceptance and familiarity of the Celine Dion song would seep over into the familiarity of Hey Ya. And it worked. It was a marketing tactic that really leveraged this idea of how the familiar breeds acceptance. This is important to us in terms of culture because it helps us to form relationships with each other. It helps us to listen in with each other. It helps us to really connect. And it helps us to think about how we create that sense of community and how important place can be. If I see you more, if I run into you more, that's really, really helpful. Culture occurs within buildings and beyond buildings, of course. And this is destination on steroids. In our industry, we always talk about making place a destination and making place a magnet. And I was talking to a customer recently and they said, this is like destination on steroids. I think this will be our challenge as leaders, as businesses, as cultures. We will have this opportunity to compel people back, to create spaces that are so interesting and inspiring that people want to come. I also think that we're going to be in this moment of having the opportunity to leverage FOMO, right? Fear of missing out. We want to generate that critical mass of people who are coming back and therefore who want to be there so they don't miss out on all that's going on. It's the classic bandwagon effect as we think sociologically. So let's talk about hybrid culture. How on earth do you create culture in a hybrid model? And this is through our lens of place and through all of the research that we've done. One of the things we can do is create a really compelling sense of shared purpose, a really compelling sense of being together, of mattering to each other's efforts. And this is the bandwagon effect, right? This is so interesting because when we're together in groups, we tend to draw energy from the group. We tend to become more energized. And there's something about showing up together. There's something about, parking my car in the parking lot and walking into the building and taking off my coat next to somebody who I may not work with closely, but we are showing up together and we have a common mission across the organization. It's partly about being in the work cafe and being able to look across and run into somebody that you don't know well, but somehow you're in it together. I think this is why sometimes pre-pandemic, the exercise equipment in our lower levels didn't get much use, but we would show up at the club at 5 a.m. with our baseball hats with the other people who were also showing up. There's that energy that comes from it. And purpose is really about 3 things. It's about that sense that there's something broader than myself, number 1. Number 2, it's about a feeling that I can uniquely contribute to that thing. And number 3, it's got to be about people. I'll sign up as a good corporate citizen to grow, margins at 15% a year. But what will really get me out of bed in the morning is knowing how I matter to our customers, how we're contributing to people, how we're really contributing to the communities and the humans that are the result of the value chain of our work. So one of the ways that we think about culture and creating that strengthened culture, that sustained culture, even in a hybrid model, is to give people that shared sense of purpose. Another thing we can think about is the idea of how it will be to be back in terms of how we relate to each other. And this is really interesting stuff. One of the things we know, again, sociologically speaking, is that one of the number one ways that we bond is through going through really hard times together. And we are definitely in that moment. When we go through something really, really tough, we end up forming these really strong bonds. There's a brilliant book by Rebecca Solnit called A Paradise Built in Hell. And what she does is she catalogs and talks through the different kinds of catastrophes that have happened over time. So she talks about the great earthquake and the great fire in San Francisco. She talks about tsunamis. She talks about global challenges that have wrought chaos. And one of the things that she talks about is the extent to which community is created, the extent to which people bond in going through hard times. And I think this is an opportunity for us in terms of culture and place as well. You know that old saying, never, how does it go? Never waste a good crisis. When we go through really hard times, we're able to reinforce our own capabilities. We're able to reinforce our priorities. We're able to reinforce those connections. And when we come through it on the other side, we have this moment, right, where the birds are singing and we can, reinvent ourselves and reinvent those connections. I think we're also going to be in this really interesting moment as we come back of cognitive dissonance. We'll be kind of getting back to the office. And some of you may have never left the office, right? That's super fair. If you work in labs or warehouses or manufacturing or front lines, but work overall has changed, right? Like you may not have the same density, you may not have the same dynamics. So as we get back to something, there will be this cognitive dissonance. We'll have this kind of, on one hand, emotional, mental feeling of, phew, we're back, right? We can kind of be back, and yet it will be different. We will be figuring out if we're wearing masks or not. We will potentially be continuing to social distance. Our places may have been relayed out. We may feel some vulnerability, right? Like we've gotten comfortable with our current state. And so part of what we need to do is pull people back and compel them back over the thresholds of their home offices. And that might feel a little weird. And so as we have this kind of feeling of weirdness, this feeling of, I've got to readjust and readapt, we may feel some cognitive dissonance. And that may actually introduce friction. I think we may see more conflict in the short term, right? Like that little thing that kind of annoyed you before kind of really bugs you today because you're not maybe at your best yet. You haven't totally made that adaptation. And so as we think about, one of the things I love about the Denison model is the validation that a great culture isn't one without conflict. A great culture is one that can work through conflict, that can leverage conflict, and that can allow for us to believe and think and invent differently and learn from each other. And how we handle it has everything to do with our constructive nature of culture. So I think we're in this moment where on the one hand, we'll have these amazing new bonds together. And on the other hand, we may be feeling some friction. There may be some cognitive dissonance. And the place can help with that to the extent that people know what to expect when they come back. I always like to say people don't trust what they don't understand. And so the more we can tell them about, hey, the entrances are going to be a little different. We're going to do a temperature check when you come back. You can use conference rooms without your mask. Whatever those protocols are, those will be important for people to understand. And we will have this opportunity to really use the place to reconnect. Well, here's another poll question for you. To what extent have you learned new things about your culture or your clients' cultures? I foreshadowed this question a little bit ago for you, so we can have you just answer as soon as you're ready. A, to a great extent, I've gotten lots of new insights. B, somewhat, I've learned some new things, but they're pretty much aligned with what I already knew. C, not so much, I pretty much could have predicted. Or D, I have no idea. It's morning for some of us, so maybe you need another cup of coffee. That's cool. I think this one's interesting. One of the things that we absolutely know is that my best culture might not be your best culture. In our work, we have the opportunity to work with so many different kinds of organizations, so many different kinds of culture. And you know how match matters so much. The chemistry that exists between me and what's important to me as an individual and the organization, and kind of how the organization rules. And that match makes a difference. And so we've seen there's some data that 40% of people are going to be seeking new roles and seeking to leave their current employer. Isn't that amazing? That's part of why I think this is going to be a talent revolution. 40%. And so is that because we've gone through disruption and we think, gosh, I can try something new and I feel kind of a new sense of resilience and risk-taking in a positive way? Is that because we no longer sense as much of a match with our culture? There are lots of hypotheses, but this will be a moment for culture to absolutely be an attractor or a retainer. Natalie, what are we seeing in terms of the results on this one? Awesome, 48% to a great extent. Oh, this is so cool. We would love to hear your perspectives when we get to Q&A. What have you learned? What's been a surprise? Sometimes that's a surprise to our benefit, and sometimes that's a surprise that you're like, not so much. 36% of you are saying somewhat, and 9% and 6% not so much, or some of you are having another cup of coffee. I love that. Thank you for that. It's going to be really interesting, right? Like how we're surprised today and how we continue to evolve. I think that's the other thing that we can really think about going forward. When people come back, right, even if come back means a little bit more of a return to normal, quote unquote, we are going to have this kind of human instinct to believe that what we're coming back to is it, right? Our company's figured it out. Our business leaders have made some decisions. We've kind of curated based on what we've learned, and now we're back. And I think what we're going to have the opportunity to do is absolutely learn and keep learning and keep adapting, because none of us have been through this before. We don't know exactly what it is. I was talking to a business leader the other day in a roundtable, and he said, we don't know what better is yet. We know we need to get there, but we don't know what it is yet. And I think we have this opportunity to set expectations with people that we don't think we've got it perfectly right yet. We think we're going to need to evolve. We're going to continuously improve. We're going to listen. We're going to check in. We're going to use things like culture surveys and Denison instruments in order to really understand on an ongoing basis so that we can make those right improvements. We can kind of pulse on an ongoing basis. And a culture is significantly determined by the worst behavior it will tolerate. I was working with an organization and they were utterly toxic. It was one of the most toxic organizations I've ever had the pleasure of interacting with. And someone at that time said this, and it's just so stuck with me. There's another organization that is an example here. They are very well known and very credible, and people want to work there. In fact, lots of people will take a pay cut in order to work there because it's such a craveable brand to be a part of. And what they do is they will regularly hire people who have amazing CVs, amazing lists of accolades, but they may not be great people. And they had this explicit HR strategy where they would take people who were super smart and talented, but not so great with people, and they would pair them with someone that they perceived to be a person, a people person, and really try to make that work. And it was just eroding things terribly. So they were really working hard on coming back from that strategy and really holding people accountable to behaviors. So I think this is so memorable in terms of the way that we handle behavior. So as we think about hybrid culture, part of how we create this culture, even in a hybrid model, is to hold people accountable, to make sure that we feel a sense of fairness. I think we're going to be set up for a bit of a have-not dynamic. Wow, you get to work from home a lot. Aren't you lucky? You get the greatest technology working from home. You get tons of freedom and liberation and choice and flexibility. Or, hey, you get to be in the office so much more. You get to see people. You get to have access to that great technology. You get to be there in person. Any of those may set up. And so our opportunity, I think, is to really hold people accountable to results, be super fair about how we do that, and really think about presence equity. And the other thing that will be important is visibility and accessibility. Some wonderful research from Douglas Watts that talks about leaders who are present and accessible. Leaders who are really responsive tend to be the leaders that are most appreciated. When leaders are perceived to be more empathetic, according to a Qualtrics study, people report greater levels of mental health. And this will be about social capital as well. I think we've got this opportunity to think hard about how we develop social capital, to really validate how people build social capital. And we know social capital is typically built face-to-face. We can't always be face-to-face. Lots of us have been working globally for years, but you can think about social capital as a bank balance. When we're face-to-face, we're making deposits in our social capital balance. And when we're away from each other, we just don't have as much data about each other. We can't see each other as much. We can't hear those birds chirping. That tends to be withdrawals from our social capital balance. So how do we create organizations and cultures where we have this webbing, this netting, this strength of social capital? Because it gives me a sense of fulfillment to have these strong relationships with others where I can get advice and help get things done across the organization. And that's really good for the company too, because work gets done better in those kinds of situations. And place is the most visible artifact of culture. I've talked a little bit about that. And we like to say that place shapes behavior, and behavior over time is culture. So place is about encouraging and discouraging. When we're in our physical environment together, we can get that energy from each other. We can also draw cues about how, to the extent to which we value collaboration, the extent to which we value the opportunity to give people kind of senses of health and vitality and rejuvenation, the extent to which we stay connected to our customers, the extent to which we enable people with the right technologies. So place matters a ton. And I love this as a closing thought. The best way to predict the future is to create it. We have this opportunity to accelerate. We have this opportunity to go to new or renewed places with our culture, with our organization, with our morale, with the way that we really start with people and then create great business results as well. So with that, let me hand it back to you, Dan and Nellie, and we will be super excited to take questions and comments.
Great. Thank you, Tracy, so much for a great presentation. Really inspiring, and also makes us all think. Nellie, let's first go to the questions from our participants and see if there's some things that you want to pose. I'll hold back here for a minute until we give the participants a chance.
Yeah, one of the questions that I wanted to ask was, when you were talking about work better, you talked about the new skills that will be necessary for the future of work. Could you talk more about what you believe some of those new skills and which will be the biggest stretch for us?
Yeah, that's such a great question. I love it. I think one of the critical new skills is going to be all about dealing with ambiguity. There's some really interesting data that the speed that we drive down the road has everything to do with visibility. So, living in a state where we have ice and snow, it's not always driving based on those conditions, it's driving based on visibility. So I think the skill of working through ambiguity is to be able to keep going, even though we don't know exactly what it's going to be like. The future of work is going to be faster and more uncertain, but we have to keep going in smart directions at smart speeds. So ambiguity will be huge. I think building rapport and relationships, especially across distances and remotely, will be a big deal. I think the skill of entrepreneurialism, right? Like checking in with the market, listening, being empathetic to users, being able to take appropriate risks and test and try will be really important. And so those are some of the things that come to mind. I think it's going to be also this moment for leadership, right? Like if leaders are leading on a remote basis, that's a really different challenge. Like we've got to be able to lead for results, lead for outcomes, lead for objectives, which has always been true, but we've got to do that to an even greater extent. And we've got to be able to create that sense of engagement, presence, accessibility from a distance.
Yeah, that makes sense. Totally. I have a few other questions that are coming in from the audience. Here's one that I think is interesting, and I don't know if any of us can answer this fully, but I'm sure that you have some insight. One of our participants says, I guess there isn't a universally best home to office split ratio because workplaces differ a lot. How can we figure out what ratio is best, or can we use Denison to figure out?
I love it. We are working with clients on this like daily, like hour by hour. This is what we're helping them figure out. And so we do have some methodologies and some surveys. We look especially at work modes, not job descriptions as much, but work modes. The kind of work that you do is really helpful to dictate. The other thing that's really critical is to think about your business processes and business purposes in a really intentional way. What we're seeing many customers do is reproportion their space. So they are, a lot of them, shifting the floor space from individual work to collaborative work, but they know they still need all of it. The other thing that I think is super important to point out here is that dynamic tension between individual needs and team and organizational needs. And I think we're at this moment where the pendulum has swung so far toward people and their needs and their flexibility, which is great. It's wonderful. And organizations need to create results. And we know that some of those results are best done face to face. So there's this dynamic tension between, I love to be at home in my fuzzy slippers, but I know my team needs me. And so if we're intentional about when we come in, why we come in, which processes are critical to do face to face, those will be really, really helpful to us. And that ratio question is such a numbers question. And so that's where I think a lot of times these more quantitative approaches that we take can be helpful in figuring out those ratios, as well as the qualitative approaches where teams are being intentional about when they're going to get together and when they're going to be in person together.
But the question of when and how do organizations most need face-to-face time?
Yeah. Yeah, Dan.
Is really, if everybody comes in for one day a week and never sees each other, that's very different than if everybody works from home but all comes together on Wednesday. If, creative or difficult, trust, interdependence, it's hard to put ratios on those. And it's easy to say, okay, we had a 1 day a week policy before the pandemic, so after the pandemic we're going to have a 2 day a week policy, and then we've taken care of it. What are some of the innovative things?
Can I build on that just a second, Dan? There's some really, really wonderful data about productivity. And you know how there was all this popular press at the beginning of the pandemic, like, I'm so productive, I never need to go to an office again. We never needed offices. We were so wrong-headed to think we ever needed offices. And one of the things we've learned is that at the beginning, there was kind of this panic productivity. People were, running to keep up, and they were trying to be visible, and they were worried about job security. But many people have kind of hit a wall in terms of productivity, and they want to get back to their people and feel that human connection. The other thing that we know based on data and studies that have been done is that you may be able to do rote or routine work or alone work pretty successfully from home. But if you are doing work that is complex, problem solving, or speed oriented, or where you need that sense of trust, or at key moments in a project, beginning of a project, conflict moment, gateway moment, those are the times when we really especially need to be face to face. So sorry about that.
Send us that study.
All right,
Pass
I
it
will.
around. I'd love to see that.
Yep.
Back to Nellie. I could do, like, Tracy and I could talk for the rest of the day.
We could.
As always. But back to Nellie.
Here's an interesting question. How are you seeing CRE roles evolving in the pandemic to accommodate a hybrid environment, especially in terms of stronger relationships with HR, IT, and business?
Oh my gosh, I feel like that's a plant question. Somebody out there already knows the answer to this question, and they planted it for us. Yeah, CRE, corporate real estate, we are absolutely seeing corporate real estate having a greater and greater responsibility for culture. We're absolutely seeing this super interesting trend of HR, IT, and real estate working more and more closely together. We used to see HR at the table in terms of place-oriented decision-making as a group that could say no, but they couldn't necessarily say yes. Like, they could stop a decision, but they weren't necessarily the decision makers. And we are absolutely seeing that HR is incredibly more central and strategic to a lot of those decisions. And the other thing that's really interesting is this incredible trend toward well-being. I just did a couple of articles on this for Forbes, and talked to a number of senior HR leaders at really, really well-known organizations. And well-being is becoming so central, so strategic, so owned across the organization, not just an HR issue anymore. And so that's about our focus on people. It's about our policies and practices. It's about our places that really, really move us toward areas where we can be rejuvenated, where we have biophilic solutions. And so that well-being piece is also what's been uniting that HR, IT, and real estate group.
Here's an interesting question that I think that you've definitely spoken to, but maybe you could elaborate a bit more on. In a hybrid environment, is it critical that people still have personal space in their office?
Yeah, the debate is raging, right? And the jury's definitely out. I would say from a sociological and a human point of view, we do crave a sense of territory, right? Like, we want to know that we have our own space. But I think we can also achieve that through a sense of choice, because territory is also partly related to autonomy. I get to choose. I'm a grown-up. I have some control over what's going on around me. So our experience is the more you create choice and control, that's actually perfectly correlated in a study we did even back in 2017 with engagement. When people had more choice and control, they were more engaged. So even if people don't have dedicated space or dedicated owned territory, when we give them that sense of choice and control, that helps. The other thing that is just super tactical that works brilliantly is lockers. Giving people a locker, or like, I have a drawer. I've got a drawer. I've got my own drawer. It's like the coolest, right? I'm walking around the campus. I'm choosing my best place to work every day. I'm free and easy, and I'm going to go where my work dictates. But I got my own drawer. And so I think, never underestimate the power of a drawer or a locker. That's your takeaway message for the day. That's your brilliance for the day. Scary.
I like it.
We're almost at time, and I know that we have to transition to our next speaker. Dan, did you have any last minute things you wanted to ask Tracy?
Tracy, I think that it's, we had this discussion a bit yesterday with Dave Brandon when he started talking about how much money corporations have saved on travel budgets and on real estate and, office costs. And it made me think for a minute, oh, wow, we're going to have to actually make the case to get these resources back. It's not going to be like, the governor has removed the mask mandate, so here's an extra gazillion on travel. What are the things that you have seen in Steelcase's customers where people are being most effective at making the case for needing to spend resources on creating the future?
Yeah, boy, that's a great question. I was part of that session yesterday that you're referencing. And I also loved Graham's points and his comment about Narnia, about the group that was more disconnected. I think that we're at this moment where we're actually going to be able to make the business case more intentionally for when we're together and how we're together. And I think we're going to be so much more conscious of the value of the stuff that happens outside the meeting rooms. So you could make a case that we can do all the meeting room stuff virtually, right? Like I can write on the whiteboard and share it with you all, and we can talk to each other and all that. But the thing we can't do is tour Barcelona together. The thing we can't do is have dinner together, break bread together, have a glass of something together. And that, what I've been hearing in terms of the research, in particular on travel, is that those will be the intentional moments. And I think the value will be, we will be even more intentional about how we build relationships and the activities that are most influential in building those. So all that will be interesting times and great learning for us for the future of work.
That's great. I guess we're at the top of the hour. We need to start the next session in 2 minutes. So we should just thank you so much for a lot of inspiration, a lot of insight. And we look forward to the next discussion. Thanks so much, Tracy.
Thanks for having me.
Fantastic.
See ya.
Okay.